Well, now on BBC Radio 4, we've the inside story of life in Orange for some of the former disciples of the controversial Indian guru Bhagwan Rajneesh, as we join Sue MacGregor for the reunion.
Perhaps it was inevitable after the new freedoms of the 60s, but by the 1970s, millions of young people in the West began to look east for spiritual inspiration. They found plenty of Indian gurus, Japanese Zen masters and other Eastern sages happy to oblige. The Beatles found their Maharishi. For others, it was the Bhagwan Shri Rajneesh, who at his peak claimed 300,000 followers. The media, though, were more interested in his fleet of Rolls-Royces and his liberal attitudes to sex. For today's reunion, we reunite a group of former disciples or sannyasins of the Bhagwan, and with them follow the progress of his communities from India to England to Oregon in the United States, where the dream eventually collapsed. Back in the 60s, hippiedom and flower power led many quite naturally towards a new kind of philosophy. Hare Krishna was one way. The rather giggly Maharishi was another.
You seem also to have caught the imagination of the pop stars in this country.
What is this pop star? You mean the Beatles?
Yes.
Indian writers like Nirav Chowdhury took a cynical view of this new Western obsession.
This Hinduizing among Occidentals, whether it is in America, is a means of escape, not a means of getting strength. It's another form of taking drugs.
The Bhagwan Rajneesh, a former assistant professor of philosophy, established his first foundation in Bombay in 1969. He promised transformation to all who surrendered to him.
When we moved to Pune in 1974...
5 years later, with the help of a woman called Ma Yoga Lakshmi, his foundation moved to Pune.
Within 3 months, it were hundreds. And now, as you see, it's grown into thousands.
His ashram, a place for meditation and self-discovery, began to attract thousands of Westerners, including the young Sally Ann Croft from London.
The first time I came for a holiday. I had a accountancy practice in London, and I'm happier here than I've ever been anywhere in my life.
The organisation also attracted the interests of Western journalists, including the young Christopher Hitchens, who made a BBC documentary about the phenomenon.
Its inmates and devotees resemble refugees from the 1960s. At any one time, there are about 3,000 of them in Pune, with many more disciples in communities across the world. The atmosphere is not unlike the Berkeley campus in the old days.
Live totally, live passionately, live intelligently, live lovingly.
Every morning just after dawn, the worshippers are drawn by the presence of Bhagwan to attend his daily discourse. A sign at the entrance warns all comers that shoes and minds should be left at the gate.
That each moment starts having the flavor of eternity.
But what was it like as a Westerner to be a devoted follower of the Bhagwan? Joining me round the table here are 5 people who remember the experience with perhaps different degrees of satisfaction. Anne Garrity, who moved with the Bhagwan from Leeds to Oregon in the States via India, and her son Tim Guest, the author of a moving memoir of his childhood in the communes called My Life in Orange. Siersha Sullivan from Kent, who was inspired to join by Christopher Hitchens' documentary film. Amara Proctor, a Londoner, and Basho, a former hairdresser who became a personal assistant in Oregon to one of the movement's leaders. Let me start with you, Anne, if I may. Catholic background, rather conventional perhaps. Why did you join up?
Well, what happened was I heard a tape. A friend gave me a tape and said, you might be interested in this, have a listen to it. And I put it on, and it was Bhagwan talking about the search for meaning and the search for truth, which was exactly what I was trying to do. But what was more, he was speaking about the inner dimensions of that search in a way that I had never heard anyone speak before.
What about you, Siersha?
Well, I was a housewife living up in Durham at the time, totally unfulfilled in what I was doing, could see no future other than having children and a lifetime of domesticity. And it filled me with horror and despair. And one day I was standing doing the ironing, and I saw a television programme Suddenly there was a lot of people there who all seemed to be happy, and I thought, I want some of that.
And what about you, Amara?
It was a very vulnerable period of my life. My husband had died about a year previous, leaving me with a couple of young kids, and some people opened a centre at the end of the road where there was a lot of fuss locally.
This was in North London?
It was in North London. There was going to be a lot of screaming and swearing and things like that. And one or two people said, you ought to go down there, it'd do you good. And then someone I met who went out to India came back in orange, and I felt there was some understanding, an acknowledgement about lots of stuff I was going through, having, dead husband and 2 small children. Then I didn't know what had hit me.
How about you, Basho?
As a hairdresser, I had a wonderful time with people, and I love being around people. And I had a girlfriend who was doing Sufi dancing, and I went with her to the centre in London. I did a meditation in which I felt I was connected with Bhagwan Shri Rajneesh in India.
You call him something else now,
I do
don't
call
you?
him. I call him Osho. That's how I know him presently, as Osho. His name changed to Osho a year before he died.
Tim, you didn't have much choice because you had to do what your mum Anne did. Can you remember how young you were when you could first conceive of what was going on?
I do remember, yeah. I mean, we were like disciples by default. We kind of didn't have a choice, but I remember my clothes turning orange in the wash.
How old were you?
I think I was probably 4, and I wrote to him and I said, I want to keep my name, because one of the things was everyone was given a new Sanskrit name. I wrote to him, said, I want to be a sannyasin, but I want to keep my name.
And this name change thing, Basho, I don't suppose you're going to volunteer what your original name was, are you?
That I was born with. It was Gerald.
Full name?
Dunsford. I revisited India after my trip in America, and I went back to see him, and I felt at that time my relationship with him was complete. I was really surprised that as he was dying, I had the most wonderful experience that I wasn't prepared for. And in that, for want of a better word, in meditation, I received the name Basho.
Anne?
I think, looking back, it did definitely create a dislocation for me from all my friends. My feminist friends, for example, were suddenly shocked because I was wearing a man round my neck.
Ma'am, can you explain?
We wore a necklace with a picture of Bhagwan, as he was then, in what's called a mala, and our love.
It's a sort of locket.
It was a locket, yes, on the end of a string of beads.
It was required that you renounce an awful lot, wasn't it, at the moment you joined up? Yet you also had to give, in the sense that money was required to be passed over. Did you have to give up your worldly goods to the cause? Amara?
I sold my flat, and I put my portion of the money I got for the flat into, I think it was debentures or something like that. And in return for that, I was looked after.
I never had to give any money to the commune. I was never asked for a penny. From the moment that I walked through the commune doors, I was taken care of. But I left a husband and a house behind. And eventually, my husband at the time joined me in the commune.
What did he feel when you left him behind initially?
I don't know, because I wasn't there.
You just left?
I just walked out the door and never came back.
What's your impression, Tim?
Well, I was just thinking, I gave up my Lego, definitely. Remember that? But lining up my soft toys on my bed at night, and the next morning someone would kind of take them, so it would end up being someone else's.
I gave everything.
Anne?
Happily. No one demanded it or asked of it. I sold my house, I gave my car, because for me, I was wholeheartedly committed to the dream and the vision of a way of living where everyone lived with honesty, compassion, women and men were equal. I could go on, and I was going to give everything.
But when you got to Pune, what was it like?
Well, it was wonderful. Here was my dream come true. It was a vision of paradise. And every day we would listen to Bhagwan speaking about truths and the kind of explorations that I was really wanting to make.
I remember very, very well seeing Osho, previously Bhagwan, arrive to take his seat in pure white, and to sit in his area from where he was talking was profoundly beautiful. And when he spoke, there were like roses falling from his mouth, and sometimes it was wild and shocking.
Do you feel like you were looking for someone to help with something.
I think maybe unconsciously, but I must say I was living a very successful life in London. So I didn't feel a need, but I was very surprised and very happy with what I did encounter and come across, which was Bhagwan or Osho. He was my master.
Meeting him was undoubtedly the most important meetings I have ever had in my life and radically altered everything. But I didn't feel taken over. He was there and I accepted certain strictures. You gave up, in a way, the freedom just to come and go exactly as you wanted. But there were bits about him, bits of him I thought were bonkers.
Yeah,
Listening to him sometimes, some of his discourses when he talked, especially on scientific stuff, he was talking off the wall, but it was irrelevant.
Similar, sometimes you kind of tuned out from exactly what he was saying because in a way what was more important was just the voice and him being there.
So it's very difficult to actually explain why you fall in love with someone, because that was my experience.
That's what it is.
And that is very difficult for anyone to explain.
Some bring special skills, like catering, medicine, public relations. The turnover runs into millions. For many, this ashram is home.
Draw a picture of a person. Yeah. And we take
The community in Pune was almost entirely self-contained. The education of the children of the sannyasins was pretty laissez-faire.
We provide science, mathematics, English reading, a lot of creative stuff. And they lead us. And wherever they go, we follow them.
But the Bhagwan community wasn't content to stay in India. British followers had founded their own study centres, and in 1981, on the Bhagwan's instructions, they organised an event at the Café Royal in London. Journalists were invited to attend, and Peter France for the BBC's Everyman devoted an entire programme to the Bhagwan Rajneesh.
The ballroom of a London hotel. 1,000 disciples gather to proclaim what they believe is a revolutionary discovery. That to achieve the goal of enlightenment, you don't have to suffer first.
One of the Bhagwan's prominent British disciples was Claire Soloway. She led regular meditation sessions which involved long periods of fast breathing, followed by an explosion of therapeutic noises.
The overall aim of the meditation is to help people to get in touch with and to express the feelings that they may have repressed since they were very small children. To, in a way, let off steam, you can say.
Keep saying it's wrong to have self-pity, it's wrong.
More controversial were the encounter groups in which individuals were invited to revisit their past and expel their feelings and anger.
Bones have been broken, real terror experienced. Again, the dubious theory is that violence, if unleashed, will purge itself.
Tim, can you remember the first time you saw
Well,
Bhagwan?
I mean, for us, for the children, Bhagwan was really an absence more than a presence. I remember in the English commune there was a chair which he'd once sat in, and it was reserved for him in case he ever came to sit in it again, and he never did. And I remember E.T. came out, the film, and E.T. sort of became, I think for us, kind of like a Bhagwan, it's kind of wizened creature who lived very far away, who had magical powers, and somehow had that quality of kind of magic presence that he obviously had for the people we cared about and loved.
We've heard what sound quite disturbing if you're not accustomed to that sort of thing, rather free encounter groups where people shout a lot and everything, let it all go. Was that something that was quite difficult, Amara, to deal with at first?
When I went to Pune, I'd done the heaviest encounter group I did was the sort of 3 to 7 months after my husband died. And I'd had a fairly battling encountering life, and I was given the groups that were absolutely right for me. Light, playful, have fun, stop being this responsible person, go and be an idiot, innocence, child, things like that.
And what about...
I ran encounter groups.
Yes.
Yeah. I did one of your groups. Did you? I did, yes. In fact, it was one in Newcastle.
But, I mean, again, there was a context for them because I was a clinical psychologist and I'd been working in clinical psychiatry and I'd been working with Adi Lang, and the encounter group movement started in the States. But what happened in India was that the Western techniques of encounter, which were really a group of people trying to be honest with each other, they married the Eastern ancient techniques of meditation. And so what came out of it were very powerful processes.
You've talked about the whole willingness to be part of the Bhagwan, stemming from the 60s and the new freedoms of the 60s. That extended to sexual partners as well, too. I mean, there'd been a lot of free love in the 60s. Was it even freer in the ashrams?
That was part of the explosion of energy that was happening globally, that people were waking up not just to ideas of duty and morality and discipline, but people were waking up to their energy. To be creative, you have to go beyond the norms very often, go over the edge.
Did that include women being available to multiple partners?
Only if we wanted to. I mean, women were absolutely... I mean, a lot of us were feminists. There was no way you were going to get us being forced into anything. It was an honouring of the energy of love. I mean, that was my experience.
And also honouring and recognising the energy of sex, because one of our huge problems these days is that love and sex are always sort of put together, but they're not. Doesn't mean you sort of love and cherish forever. Those are different matters.
Well, for me, it was different because I tended to fall in love with every man that I made love with. I felt I loved them. And for me, it was a lot about love and sex being connected.
Basho, you've been sitting quietly listening to the women reminiscing. What are your memories?
It's really interesting. And, love was, I think, predominant reason to be there and to stay there, quite honestly. And sexual preferences and explorations were happening in the most open, wonderful way.
Were there jealousies, though? There must have
I'm
been.
sure there were. We were human beings. Yes, absolutely.
I definitely knew excruciating jealousy.
Well, what's interesting is how so often it's being talked about in such a derogatory way by people in society who are doing far worse things behind closed doors.
I mean,
Tim,
as difficult it is to talk about sex with my mother sitting 2 steps down, I think we were occluded from discovering things for ourselves. I think that's partly what happened. And I know that from my experience, the environment was it was like the sexuality was a very bright light, and for children sometimes we didn't have enough shade, maybe, or enough shelter from that.
But you've also made it clear that it was difficult sometimes to have a close relationship with Mum because that was not encouraged.
Well, it was actively discouraged, yeah. I mean, we were limited to a couple of nights a week, I think. I would kind of sneak into her bed to spend time with her, and the people who took care of us, they would actively keep an eye on us and make sure we weren't spending too much time with our parents, yes.
I mean, if I can just say what at that time my experience was, I was giving Tim the childhood that I'd longed for. There was a richness of experience, a multitude of people to relate to, a community which was based on principles of love and freedom, a schooling that did not stifle creativity. Also, I was at the time convinced the commune would be a far better parent than me. The meaning has to come in the fact that when you've reached the goal, the masterpiece written, the utopian vision, then you reintegrate the bits that you have lost. You have to turn around. And in that redemption is a deeper meaning. And we did that.
You and Tim.
We did that.
Meanwhile, that was not Tim giving the kiss, but Basho, I have to say.
Yes, free love is always welcome.
She just expressed something really profound, and that I think it's very beautiful.
2, 3, 4. In the early 80s, the British headquarters of the Bhagwan Rajneesh moved to rural Suffolk. In a large Edwardian mansion, a carefully constructed community was built up. At its peak, it housed 450 people and called itself Medina Rajneesh. The sociologist Bob Mullen was invited to be part of it.
There are about 25 kids at Medina. They're brought up kibbutz style with lots of parents. But Rajneesh himself reckons that women ought to look at their own needs first and then maybe will not want kids. Result, no babies at Medina.
Your new name is Swami Krishnapad, and that means one who is surrendered to the feet of God.
I'm here only just to be a medium.
But the Bhagwan had even bigger plans. A world centre in the United States, in the northwestern state of Oregon.
They've just bought 100 square miles to build what they claim will be the largest spiritual centre in the world.
At first, there was a city of tents and an annual gathering of worldwide sannyasins. But construction soon began of a more permanent city on what was supposed to be agricultural land.
They're nearly all white, American, and many come from wealthy families. 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, building their new city of Rajneeshpuram.
And when we heard some of those recordings, you were rather squirming, and I wonder why.
Yes. Well, looking back, many of the cracks that later exploded in our faces, we can see them now with hindsight. So I squirmed a bit when I heard, I think it was exclamations of amazement at the meaning of this person's name.
You didn't squirm, Siersha?
I think sometimes I squirmed at the time. I did find some of the kind of music, it was called music group, and when people were taking sannyas, and I was one of the more sceptical. There used to be a group of us who would not necessarily attend music group, slightly the rebels, if you like.
These are the sing-songs that we
Yes,
heard.
yes.
I should say at this point that when the kids, we were allowed to have our own discos, the first thing we did was put a sign on the door saying no spiritual dancing.
There was a decision taken somewhere to move much of the movement to the northwestern United States, to the state of Oregon. Were you in on this decision, or did it come as a big surprise?
No, it was a surprise. I had no idea that they were going to Oregon, or we were going to Oregon. And I had a girlfriend at that time in India, and she came back to England, and we were invited to America.
And when you got there?
There were very few of us, and it was very vast, expansive land that had been bought for the commune. The intention was to create an oasis and to try to put into practice what we had learned from Osho or Bhagwan.
One of the things I found was just the amazingness, the creativity, forget your spiritual stuff, just the actual practicality of building an entire city with roads, transport systems. Do you know the water was used 3 times? And it was quite exciting because there were all these ideas happening, but the world wasn't thinking in that way then.
I mean, people were from all over the world. I mean, my husband, Swarupdas, he's an engineer, and he was called over to the ranch to do work there. And people would literally called from everywhere anybody that had a skill that would be useful would get, like Basho had, would get an invitation to go there and work.
I mean, it's incredible how a lot of the stories around Osho, Bhagwan Shri Rajneesh, and disciples that were around him, so much speculation has been on around what we talked about, the sex and blah, blah, blah. But I very rarely see reports on the incredible creativity and the intelligence, which I'm not deeming to be one. But however, Osho did attract an incredible wealth of highly intelligent people who were masters in their own field, whatever it was. It wasn't all hunky-dory. I don't want to paint a picture where it was all roses. But within that, there was an incredible wealth of joy. We worked 14, 16 hours a day, but not as a duty. It was an absolute joy.
One thing I really remember about the ranch is the scale. I mean, it was unbelievable. As a child, I'd never been so lonely and never been so free. I mean, it was like everybody I ever knew was there, and you would bump into people, you would drift around. It felt huge.
Who gave the orders?
There was a hierarchy. There was a hierarchy of mums, basically, and it was usually women that were in charge of each of the departments. And then, very much like a business is run, each department had a department head who was a mum, and then that mum would then report to the next tier above, and so on.
Bhagwan had said that women had suffered for many lifetimes, and he was going to put them in charge, so the women ran pretty much all the communes, right?
Did it really work as smoothly as being suggested?
No, it wasn't. No, it's not always so smooth. And I mean, we're all suggesting how wonderful it is and was, and within that, there were difficult times too.
The women were in positions of power, and I was one of those women. However, what we also learned was that men and women, when given power, equally use it creatively and equally abuse it.
The group sex guru who's in the United States trying to create a paradise on Earth has been told to do it somewhere else. He's Bhagwan Shri Rajneesh, who's said to have 300,000 followers. Now he's living in the wilds of Oregon with some of those followers and almost as many Rolls Royces.
Buying the rolls from a Beverly Hills dealer is a publicity gimmick by a cabal of women disciples who manipulate the cult.
Why give the enlightened one 27? Why not just give him one?
Why not 355?
Would you like to?
Oh, yes.
Each afternoon, disciples watch the guru's daily drive. A wily mystic with a sense of show business. He hasn't spoken publicly for 2 years.
They had many very subtle types of harassment.
But the local population in the town of Antelope felt increasingly hostile towards the community, which they said was trying to take over the area.
There were hostilities towards us. We had
Susan Hagen was a British follower who was by now closely involved in the management of the community.
But we had a sense that we were under siege.
As Bhagwan's public silence continued, his role as leader was taken over by a formidable woman called Sheila, who turned on local reporters.
Leave us alone. Leave us alone. That's all I want. Leave us alone. Let us live in peace. Stop bothering us. Stop persecuting us.
But a bomb planted at the Bhagwan Rajneesh Hotel by a Christian fundamentalist raised the stakes still higher. As a result, the self-styled peaceful community began to arm itself and brought in a paramilitary-style defence force.
I tell you, the country is so bigoted, it deserves to be taken over.
Well, we heard there was a shooting range. It wasn't a real battle, but there was a very real battle in another sense with the local residents of Oregon about the whole idea of you incomers.
Well, I think it was... Was it 5-6 years? I think there's something...
The cracks, looking back, began to appear a long time before, certainly, I began to realise things were happening. But at the time, the human mind has an amazing capacity to keep on rationalising. And I loved this dream. I was willing to suffer for it. And so when things little odd things began to happen. One, for example, was we had to be positive all the time. Now, this ran counter to everything about my understanding, which is we had to be real, not positive. And suddenly I'm being told I have to be positive all the time. And the cracks got wider and wider.
It became almost Stalinistic. I mean, there's a point at which Sheila, Bhagwan's secretary, was faxing menus to communes around the world, and she was every week was reducing slightly the amount of food that people were allowed to eat.
This was the formidable Sheila.
It was coming from Sheila, yes. There's things with all these diktats, and we were told that we had to, the actual physical space that we were living in had to become more and more like the ranch, and we lived in a beautiful 1912s manor house that was decorated supremely and had been loved. And then we were told, no, we had to put lino down on the beautifully polished floors because that's what they did in Oregon.
It's so complex. We're trying to describe the birth and death of a whole religion, a whole spiritual movement. I mean, it was heartbreaking, but it was also so real too.
Basho, you knew Sheila better than most because you were her personal assistant.
Yes, I was for a time, yes.
Did she come across as this rather power-crazy woman to you?
I loved Sheila, I must say. She was a formidable woman who, at the time, I believed, rightly or wrongly, was doing and helping to create the commune in which we were creating. And we talk about cringing. Sometimes I did cringe at the fact of how she did really antagonise our neighbours. However, in the context of it, that it was a reaction a lot to what was being projected onto us. And
but there was a great deal of hatred directed towards all of you from outside.
That's how
you can understand that the local people felt their way of life
I absolutely
was being changed.
They were, it was.
Also, and when you're building heaven, you don't mind stepping on a few people's toes, you know.
It seems so.
Yeah.
But so antagonism was created, and in that situation, I think it's very possible for myself and anyone to become drunk with that power.
I feel we were all responsible for what happened. We all created the dream and we were all responsible for its disillusion. And that is one of the great teachings of that whole adventure for me. The very things that I was so devoted to finding an escape from actually arose out of the same dream.
What did you, for instance, Siersha, what did you feel about the 92 or 3, whatever it was, Rolls Royces that the Bhagwan owned, which local people thought was completely ridiculous?
Well, I actually never had a problem with that, because I always was thinking that, in a way, it was the joke against the whole material society, that a great spiritual master could have all these Rolls Royces and just upset everybody, and I thought it was quite amusing.
I mean, if people want to give him a Rolls Royce, if they've got a lot of money and they need to demonstrate it by giving him a Rolls Royce, well, if they want to do that, then why shouldn't they? There were things that I did question. I wondered sometimes, I thought, why does Sheila have to be so provocative and aggressive and things? But the abuse of power wasn't only on the Sheila level. You came up against it yourself. You came up against the person who's just responsible for you.
In order to get things done locally, there had to be a majority who was for it on the local council, the local authority, if you like. And this was when, very, very controversially, homeless people were shipped in, recent immigrants were shipped in, out-of-work people were shipped in who had nothing at all to do with the commune.
Yeah, it seems like, I think there were 10,000 disciples in Oregon, and basically, I think it was Sheila announced that they were going to be true to the American spirit, and they were going to welcome homeless people to the ranch. And 10,000, suddenly there were 10,000 homeless. So there were as many homeless people as there were sannyasins suddenly in the ranch. And it became very strange. Such a strange thing that happened. It kind of became very extreme and strange what was going on.
I mean, I still had the stars in my eyes, and you could kind of pick and mix your explanation as to why they were there. And I managed to understand at that point that they had come here because unconsciously they were also seeking enlightenment. So I created a myth that kept me still keeping faith with the utopian dream.
But what about shipping in the guns?
Well, the guns,
that
was ghastly to see to see peacekeepers. Were they called peacekeepers?
Yes, with guns.
With peace force or something, with machine guns. And I'm thinking,
a total shock.
Where's the love gone? What's happened? And
I managed to integrate even that. This was the dark side of the dream. It has to have its. I mean,
everybody kept fooling themselves because the dream that we had experienced up until that point, where I'm speaking for myself, had been so wonderful, had been so positive that when all this started to happen, I just kept trying to pretend that everything was okay still.
I did too.
As horrific as it seems at the time, I truly felt that we were responding and reacting to the attacks that were coming our way. It was to defend ourselves from an attack. I also did train in myself in a rifle. And me, who was a peace-loving hairdresser, was in a moment, in a situation, learning how to fire a gun. Part of me was freaked out of it, about this whole concept. And the other part of me was, well, in the old days they used bows and arrows for Zen archery. This was a modern meditation.
There's something about the guns, to me,
Tim.
That's basically it's exciting. Here you are, you're doing something, you're special, you're a little corner of the world, you know something the rest of the world doesn't, and in a way there's a kind of abdication of responsibility, I think. You're really saying, I don't have an effect. What happens to the people nearby is not important because we're caught up in something that's bigger and more special, and it's better.
We don't want these people at all.
By the end of 1985, the situation in Oregon was out of control.
The county road goes directly to hell.
Sheila, who'd become a hate figure for local people, and indeed for many of the community, fled. Soon after, Bhagwan was deported from the United States. As Rajneeshpuram broke up, the television news crews moved in.
A ghost town. But unlike the hundreds of others that litter the old Wild West, this is a new city.
Federal investigating authorities had already moved in to investigate accusations of immigration irregularities at Rajneeshpuram. While they were on site, they also discovered illegal wiretapping, a bizarre attempt at mass poisoning in a number of local restaurants, and a plan to assassinate the district attorney himself.
As I drove into town,
FBI investigator Lynn Enyart.
The first thing I saw was a couple engaged in sex on a bridge at the far west end of the community. And that more or less set the stage for a very bizarre 2 months that I spent in this commune conducting a federal investigation.
After he left the US, Bhagwan Rajneesh embarked on a world tour, speaking in whichever countries would host him. He changed his name to Osho. But in 1990 he died of heart failure, or, as his followers believed, simply ended his visit to planet Earth.
By the time of his death, he'd become, in the eyes of the world, a charlatan, though he still has followers today.
Even after the Bhagwan's death, there were repercussions for many of those involved in the organisation during its final stages.
Several members of the cult decided it would be important to assassinate the United States attorney.
That assassination plot against the local Oregon prosecutor was allegedly hatched by Sally Ann Croft and Susan Hagen. In 1995, both women were sentenced to 5 years for conspiracy to murder. The rise and fall of the Bhagwan Rajneesh was seen by many as a story of a cult leader whose personal greed and lust for power proved fatal. For others, their time with the charismatic leader was profoundly and positively life-changing. Some are still with the Osho organisation in Pune, which continues his work. Amara, so the end came really quickly. It began to unravel pretty fast. What do you remember of that time?
I was on the ranch in Oregon when, first of all, when Sheila went, and then when Bhagwan went. I mean, we were stunned, amazed. Rumour went absolutely bonkers. Different things were said all the time. Secret tunnels. It was like living in the middle of an airplane novel.
I was in Germany. We would get faxes from the ranch, and they would be posted up, and we'd be gathering round, reading the latest information. And for me, this was such a shock that I then, being such a devoted follower to this point, flipped into the opposite. Extremely angry, enraged. I cut up my clothes, I burned my mala, I called him the Antichrist, and for a period I was aflame with sheer rage.
But Basho, as Sheila's assistant, you presumably stuck with her when she went.
I did.
You flew out of the United States with her?
I did. Without pretending to be too naive, I think there was a certain sense of naivety on my part. However, I take responsibility for leaving at that time that I did with her. Pack of bags, okay, we're off. And I didn't really question it.
Had your dream shattered as well at that point?
It was, at that moment, yes. I was, with all the stories that were escalating, of which I was becoming aware of, I was becoming, I think, catatonic.
Siersha?
Well, I'd already left the commune by the time this all happened. I'd come to, at some point previous in that year, I'd been given an ultimatum by the commune. I was given the option to have an abortion or leave the commune. This was after...
Who asked you to take
It was
that
one of
decision?
the mummers from America. They were flying over to all the communes in Europe to give their input into the commune.
And what was your answer?
I can't repeat it on the air. And I left. I think I left within the hour. I seem to remember I phoned my father up and I asked my father to come and collect me, and he drove up that day and collected me, and I never went back.
He was called, Bhagwan at this point, a charlatan on the television news. What was your reaction to that?
Well, if he was a charlatan, he did me no harm.
I think he did me harm.
Tim?
Yeah, and just in the absence that was surrounded, the damage that was done in my relationship with my mother, I think he did do me harm.
Well, my immediate thing is you're laying the whole lot on Bhagwan, and surely Bhagwan didn't say to Anne, yeah, you've got to give me all your devotion. She fell in love with him, so you can't lay it all on him. Some of it's to do with what goes on between the two of you.
No, I don't feel I'm laying it all on him.
Well, that was how it came over when you spoke just then.
I do feel that we're sitting around you all being very positive about the guy, and actually I feel he personally wounded me.
But this whole adventure, it was a great, amazing adventure that had everything in it, from the brightest light to the darkest shadows. And there was also something which you cannot talk about. There was in the heart of it, and this is the difficult bit to express in words, there was a sacred mystery in it all.
But I learned so much about me and about that it was my choice and my responsibility. And one of the things that upset me when the ranch finished is everybody got off the ranch. We had this chance because it was a good thing. It was a viable working concern. But no, he went, so everybody upped. But it came round, especially when he died, that I used to get upset that a lot of people would, in a way, abnegate their personal responsibility and lay it on to Osho. And to me, it's always he was saying, your choice. You look at it, you take responsibility for what you do and choose to do.
What are you all doing now with your lives, Basho?
I'm working with Skiros, who arrange holistic holidays in Greece and Cuba and Thailand.
And what are you doing?
Well, I live in the wilds of Cumbria, and I walk the dog and the mountains and the beaches, and I write. I've written some books about love, one of my favourite subjects, and probably like Basho, I think I enjoy ordinary life very much more than I think I would have done without everything.
Siersha.
I'm a shamanic practitioner and complementary therapist, and I run workshops on shamanism, and I have a website, shamanicplanet.com.
And Amara?
Oh, I'm a North London architect, landscape architecture. Much the same that I've done most of my life. So it's much easier now being in the building trade and architecting than it was 30, 40 years ago.
It's also really lovely to hear everyone has their story.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Everyone is particular to ourselves, no matter what it is.
But it's not in the end a very happy story, is it, Siersha?
For me, it was a very happy story, yeah. I gained an enormous amount, and I think, like Anne said, that it was an enormous learning process, and I look back at my time in the commune with great fondness.
I would agree. For me, it was a very unhappy story, actually, but there was a pearl of great price at the end.
Anne Garrity, Siersha Sullivan, Basho, Amara Proctor and Tim Guest. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That edition of The Reunion was produced by Katrina Fallon. The series producer was David Prest, and it was a whistle-down production for BBC Radio 4. Sue MacGregor will be back with more reunions later in the year.